Conrad, I appreciate you taking some of the time. So just tell me a little bit about how you decided to work at Badger, and you kind of got a really interesting past. Tee us up with how you started at the company and walk us a little bit through it.
Well, oddly, I came to the company in a very unusual way. I had sold this company a computer system, and through the sales process and post-sales process, I got to know the owners and had a long-term dream of getting involved with a company where I could take an ownership position. And we began talking about that possibility. They offered me a position of employment with the idea that over a longer period of time, I would become a shareholder and eventually buy the business from them. They did not understand the complexity of selling a business, nor did I understand the complexity of buying a business, but they were honorable people. And as it turned out, I went to work for them.
Is that when you were selling the computer system? Is that when you were working? Was it Xerox or IBM?
Xerox Corporation.
Because that's when you were working with Mike. What's Mike's last name?
That is correct. Mike.
So you were selling the ERP or the accounting packages for the companies similar in the manufacturing industry?
Absolutely. So, God, I can't think of Mike's last name right now, but he's kind of turned into a sales guru. Oh, I've got some timers right now. I can't think of it.
Anyways, but so you were selling the software packages to companies in that industry?
This is back in the days. This is before mini computers, pal. This was back in the day. I'm sharing. I went to sell these guys a system, and I got so involved in getting it installed and got to learn their business. I went to work for them, and 90 days after I went to work for them, I really uncovered that the company was, they bought a computer system to solve a lot of problems, and found out that they were literally technically bankrupt.
Is that because when you're implementing it, you're probably pretty heavily digging into the financials and understanding a lot of the intricacies of the P&L statement, right? Because of
mostly understanding their processes, but in the process of that, they sent me down to meet the banker. The banker had told me that they were a classified loan, and but they had not yet communicated that to the owners. And I went back, and the owner told me, "Oh, go down to the bank. We've got an unlimited line of credit," where they had no credit left. The two owners weren't really speaking another. I went back to him and said, "You either need to put me in charge or fire me." And his response to me was, "God has answered my prayers. You are now in charge." And I began to put the first business plan together.
And what was the time frame from when you had started as an employee until that conversation?
90 days.
No kidding, huh?
So it was unbelievable. Their daughters. It was a St. Patrick's Day, March 17th of 1982, I believe. And I told them, make sure you take care of the payables. And they paid every payable in the system and sent the checks out, overdrawing the bank account by hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so I went down to the bank, found out that not only wasn't the bank going to add any to the line of credit, but they're getting ready to call the loan. So I jumped on the phone, and I had my conversation with the owner. Says, God has answered my prayers. I jumped on an airplane and went and visited the four largest people that we'd written checks to. Told them the good news was the check was in the mail. The bad news, it was that the checks were going to bounce, so that we wouldn't bounce every check that they owed to everybody. There were probably 100 checks that went out that day.
That's called cash flow management right there.
That's called cash flow management.
So how did you? So you got on the plane and you just immediately went out to the
four biggest met the four biggest credit managers. One of them was the Square D Corporation in Ohio, or in Chicago, and also the other person in Chicago was a gal by the name of Bernice Feltz. She was the GE credit manager. I jumped on a plane and then went down from there, went down to Atlanta and spoke to the guy from Lithonia Lighting. I'll never forget his southern drawl. I kind of explained what happened. I said, "My God, son, I've never heard such a story, but I've never heard such a story. It must be true." And then went up to Raritan, New Jersey and met with T&B. And my only promise to him was the check's already bad. You need to work with me for another 30 days. Don't shut us down. And I'm giving you my word that next month you get paid and nobody else does.
So when you're having these conversations, do you have the plan already in your head of how you're going to approach it, or you working?
Hell no, baby. I was on a wing and a prayer. I was just buying time. And I knew that you can't have checks bouncing to every single creditor that you have. So it was kind of, okay, who were the four biggest ones? And told them that next month they would get paid first. So they were in for $1. I was asking them to go in for another dime.
Mm-hmm.
Give me another 30 days, and 30 days from now, I will be back to you with a written business plan of what we are going to do.
So walk me through what's going through your head when you're sitting down in front of the pad and the paper or your computer when you're going to start that business plan.
What I was really thinking is I really need to get fired and go back and get my job at Xerox. But
that didn't pan out.
that didn't pan out. I figure I need to get fired quickly or find a way to make this work. And the first thing you need is a little bit of time. And so I went and I created time.
At that point, you got nothing on the hook, right?
I got nothing on the hook other than I just walked away from a big job and a big paycheck, and I've taken a big pay cut, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh, Christ. So it was really, I went back and got the time, and I had an accounting background, and I'd just gotten back from a GE financial management school. And this is back in the days when it was before Lotus 123. Spreadsheets, which are really common today, did not exist except on big computers. And oddly, it was taught by three professors from Ohio State University, where I'd gone to school. And I mean, I'd literally gotten back from this thing a week before this occurred to the business. And they taught me financial modeling. And with that, I ended up building on a very simple model on one 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, kind of the key assets and the key liabilities, an income statement and a fund flow, and sat there and started building a model of how to rescue this business. And within kind of put this thing down and then went a month later, paid the three vendors on time and did a couple of unique things. I went back to the largest vendor and asked them to put what we owed them on a 24-month note.
Any kind of interest or something that you specified?
Yeah, I don't even remember what the interest rate was at the time. But it was so that we could start cash discounting. The reason they went along with it is they didn't really have another good choice.
Because they wanted to get paid.
They wanted to get paid, and they're figuring the old management team wasn't getting it done. And I came up with a plan where I sat there and said, we're going to go close this one operation that was, these guys had been operating it, but they didn't have a set of books on the thing. And I think they were, it appeared that they were operating well below the break-even point of the business. And that enabled me so we shut a branch down.
Did you have a bunch of inventory that you were able to?
Had a bunch of inventory that we're able to bring back into the business and use, a bunch of receivables that we were able to collect and completely get our computer system implemented and get, one of the issues they had is they were so slow in invoicing. I couldn't tell you how much the backlog was. We used to measure it with a ruler. They had billing that was being done post-sale. And so they may have had $1 million worth of receivables that were not yet billed. And so it was basically create some cash, get a computer system in, start doing transactions a day in a day. I mean, this was not rocket science, but this is in the back of the days. They had
they had a balancing it like a checkbook almost.
It was kind of like a checkbook, exactly.
So when you're doing all this stuff, did you, I mean, obviously with some self-interest when you're sitting down, did you have any idea what you were going to ask for the business? Or was it just pretty much they, plopped it in your lap and said, just save us, give us whatever you think we can? Or how did,
Well, no, there was no talk of ownership at this point. I mean, the ownership had not yet taken place. So the first thing that I did was really create credibility with the bank, create credibility with the vendors, and basically the business, and finally financially tell the truth. So the financial statements showed up that we lost over $250,000 that year, and yet by tightening things up and by getting the bills done on time and by actually reporting to the bank an honest inventory, which they'd never known how to do, the financial statements showed that we had lost $250,000, but I also reduced bank debt and improved cash flow by $750,000,
wow. So what was the top line revenue around this time?
about $5 million. As we're proceeding, we're still haven't made any money, in fact, but we were getting financial statements out on time. We were producing accurate and timely financial statements. We created cash flow by recognizing assets that in fact existed by billing on time, started managing the inventories better, created cash, which was all used to reduce debt, either with creditors or with the bank. And that created confidence in my ability to manage that business.
So what's the attitudes or the perspectives of the other owners at this point? I mean, are they looking at you like a savior, or are they kind of, because I've seen other cases where now we've got a business that's worth keeping. Now we're gonna hold Conrad to that, or how does the dialogue go between you and
well, that's where the next interesting thing came into play. The two brothers that owned the business had inherited it. The one that was the principal shareholder, really, the business was not his love. He was not a natural entrepreneur. And the other brother was a wonderful full charge bookkeeper, but also not very entrepreneurial. Their father had been entrepreneurial. So you go into this next generation, they inherited a business that
didn't understand the inherent risk that their dad took.
They didn't really understand things. And at this time, we'd been talking about me becoming a shareholder, and we started working with the outside accountant. And then the principal shareholder found out that he had cancer. And it was a recurrence of a prior cancer. And that resulted in very rapid negotiations to buy the business.
Where is that in the timeline of you negotiating with the vendors and the bank and everything?
Well, this is about a year later.
Okay.
But by that time I'd created great confidence with the bank and with the supplier community and with the employees and with the customers. Up until that point, I'd never managed or owned anything other than my paper route as a kid. I'd never had any employees. So it was kind of baptism by fire.
When you were going through and essentially saved the business that these guys inherited and created a asset that was worth keeping, I mean, did you just do it because it was a challenge and you just knew it was the right thing to do? I mean, you at that point prior to the cancer and the conversation with the main principal, did you just
these were good, honest guys, and really understand at this point this business had just still shown a loss of $250,000.
Yeah.
And income is the greatest indicator of what a business happens to be worth.
Mm-hmm.
And so the blue sky that was in the business was really me. Okay. And so it really wasn't worth much at this point in time. And what happened is when the primary shareholder ended up with cancer, his greatest concern was, because he didn't trust his brother who would have become the dominant shareholder, to run the business and take care of his wife and get the value out of it. And the business didn't have a huge amount of value at that point in time. because it was barely a going entity, and I had no real money to go buy that business. So we
Mhm.
constructed a very unusual transaction. And it was because of the financial modeling that I had done. And remember, I had very little to lose at this point in time. But the crazy thing is, I went out and borrowed $10,000 on MasterCard and I bought stock in the business.
Hmm.
And then I had the business buy the stock of the owners. And the minute that I did that and put it on a 4-year note, and the minute that I did that, the business was now technically bankrupt. It had negative net worth
Because of the debt that the owners had put on it.
because of the debt that the business had incurred to buy their shares. So
Mhm.
their shares were exchanged with me basically on a promissory note to be paid over 4 years. And then what gave them incentive to do it is I agreed to pay them 30% of profit for the next 10 years. So the crazy thing is, if I succeeded, I won, they won, the bank won, and the employees won. And the bank went along with it because the bank's attitude was, if Conrad leaves, we're screwed. Okay. The owners went along with it because he was, he was sitting there thinking, well, my brother can't run this thing without him. And then my family isn't going to get anything. And hell, I had nothing to lose, but I had this opportunity in front of me. So I was literally the most leveraged corporation in America.
A little bit riding on your shoulders, huh?
A little bit, yeah. But I mean, but it didn't seem like risk to me because I felt like
Worst case scenario, you go back, you get your job back at Xerox, huh?
I had literally all kinds of personal guarantees, but I had nothing to get back up my guarantees. I was in a poker game where I needed to win
Yep.
because I had no, I couldn't, you know, who was it that I think it was Chichi Rodriguez or no, it wasn't Chichi, but the Mexican golfer. Pressure's when you got a big bet and no money in your pocket. That's pressure. When you're when you're playing for $1 million purse, that's not pressure. Pressure's when you're paying for $50 and you don't have the money to pay the bet. And so that's kind of where I was at. But because of this financial modeling, I really began to understand what, I could grow the business like crazy, and that wasn't going to work because I would have needed to borrow more money for inventory and receivables. And it really boiled down to, I thought, well, I'll string the vendors out. Well, I found out you can't really do that. What we had to do was control operating expenses and start making money no matter what happened. And so I bought this business and I was levered, we had negative net worth. When my net worth became positive, I had $33 of debt for every dollar of equity.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a very detailed business plan that showed modest growth. It showed asset control. And most importantly, it showed expense control. And the beautiful thing about the distribution business is your ability to operate profitably is not nearly as dependent upon your volume. It is controlling your expenses relative to your volume. You go out and you buy a manufacturing business, you go buy a golf course, you go buy something big, you got a fixed nut you got to maintain each month, whether it's, so we were able to cash flow the business and we were able to control the assets. And so we started making a little bit of money each month. And each month, things would get better and better and better, although it took a long while. But I, created this credibility with the bank, and the banking environment was a whole lot different back then. These guys were in so much trouble back then. Instead of me being they would do whatever I almost would ask them to do. And day after day, our net worth went up. The value of the business went up every day of profitability caused it to go up. So some
So
months,
how many years then from the moment that you had the first the business finally got into the black, and then how? Because from the stories that you've told me, you went through some of your own personal issues, which we can get to in a second. But between the moment that you started making money and to the moment that you walked into and kind of your next stage, how many years was that the business was operating like that?
Well, I owned the business more than 20 years, and I'd sit there and tell you ultimately when I sold the business, my debt to equity was 2 to 1.
Wow.
But every year you'd mark improvement, and I literally walked around. You're going to laugh at this, but that stupid business model that I put together, I had it going out 10 years, and I used to keep it in my wallet because sometimes I was still a very high risk business. But if you see that you're making profit year in and year out, and you see that you're getting there. So it was probably 2 or 3 years before the business had even positive net worth in it. And the interesting thing that I learned about banks is you got to give them a plan that shows that you're going to pay them back. The truth of the matter is they don't care if they ever get paid back because what they sell is borrowed money.
They're looking for cash flow too.
They're looking for cash flow. And so if you can show that your debt to equity is improving, they want to give you more money instead of less money. It probably took 20 years before I didn't even really need banks any longer, or I could go to any bank.
Isn't that crazy how banks all of a sudden you could be completely leveraged, but if you're showing them that you've got profit, they're just going to continue to give you more money.
Well, and one of the crazy stories along the way, I think I've told you this, but before I went into that bank the very first time when we were in big trouble, before I'd actually bought the business, I'd read Iacocca's book about how he had turned Chrysler around, and
Great book.
There was a chapter in about dealing. There was one bank that could have held up the whole deal. Well, I wasn't Chrysler, but there was one bank that could have caused the big problem, and I went down and told them they needed to lend me more money before I'd even gotten anything turned around. I said I needed some money to buy some time, and the guy said, "Well, we're not going to do it." I said, "Fine, I'm going to quit the organization. And where would you like me to deliver the inventory and receivables? Because I think I got a better chance of collecting on that than you do." And he looked at me, and I could see the blood fall out of his face. And so he went from this hard ass to realizing. And I learned an old saying: when you're a small businessman, if you owe the bank $100,000, you're in trouble. If you owe them $1 million, they're in trouble. And so, and it's just making sure you understand that. And so, I mean, I became kind of a poster child to my vendor. I became the poster child to the bank. And it was really interesting. There were hiccups along the way, but because I communicated so effectively with them, I got to the point where, I would walk in and say, "Hey, I need a little bit more money to cover this or cover that." And I became bankable. The whole business about character, and I forget what the 5 C's of credit are, but, one of them ended up being character. And this was it became a character loan because it certainly, I didn't have any credit history. The collateral I had was only valuable to me. It wasn't collateral that would have been good to the bank. I mean, what are they going to do with the receivables and inventory? And the minute you don't have inventory, people aren't going to, the receivables aren't collectible when you're no longer a going entity because
they don't want to run your business is pretty much what it comes down to.
No, well, they couldn't. And
Yep. So when you got to the point where when you said you sold it, so walk us a little bit through the process of, what was the triggering event that you had in order to be on the sell side compared to all the success that you've had over the years?
Well, it was pretty interesting. I had assumed, like a lot of small business owners do, that maybe I was going to pass this business on to my family or my son. And as I'm operating the business, it became very apparent to me that he had very little interest in that. Nor does he because he's my son, doesn't necessarily mean he's got the business skills that are required to run a business. So that was one ingredient in it. The second ingredient in it is I ended up having some health issues. I ended up having at age 40, relatively early this is maybe 12 years into my ownership of the business, I had open heart surgery. And
it's young for open heart surgery.
Very young. I had my LAD was 95% blocked, And I bounced back from that relatively quickly. And, I was still a very young guy and didn't have enough money to really go sell the business at that point in time. 8 years later, I had my second bout with heart disease. And oddly for me, fortunately for me, is a lot has happened in these last 27 years. But, um, my first surgery was required because they didn't have stents. And then the second time it happened, they put stents in, but they weren't medicated. So they clogged right back up 30 days later. So I'd had by age 50, I'd had two open heart surgeries, and my industry was consolidating. Distributors was a very fragmented industry when I got into it. The top five distributors in the United States only controlled 25% of the business. But that was rapidly changing because instead of it just being bought up by the guy next door, all of a sudden, two foreign companies, European companies, had come into the United States and started gobbling up businesses. And I was at a point where kind of that was the second observation. And the third observation is I had the world's greatest computer system inside of my business, but I couldn't communicate with any suppliers and I couldn't communicate with any customers. And this is about the time when the internet was really and being connectivity and transparency between customers. And all of a sudden, I would have had to get a more modern computer system to be able to do those kind of things.
So you're talking about another heavy investment in order to get to the next stage.
Well, I wasn't even sure it might have required my entire net worth at that point in time to get to that kind of computer system. So kind of three things going on. Health, number one, family not being interested, number two, and consolidation going on around me. And number four, the computer investment. And I'm sitting there thinking, how much sense does this make? So I ended up selling Badger Electric to Viking Electric that was 10 times my size. I was at about 15 million at this time. They were 150 million. And within a year, they were bought out by a European company called Sonopar. And today, Sonopar is a $25 billion company with 165 companies, just like Viking Electric was, that are located in 65 countries around the world.
That's a massive consolidation right there.
Yes, and they are independently held. And so my little business from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, what I define as my world-class popcorn stand, is now part of a
big conglomerate. So how did you go about valuing that business? So you've got some of the challenges of our listeners are going through or might go through is when you're 1/10 of the size of someone else, you got a different skill set that the acquirers got. You've got different ways to go about valuing it, and you've kind of got this dance that goes around. How did you guys go about doing that?
Well, it was kind of interesting because I went out and met a number of the logical acquirer at that time would be someone that had shared lines, shared vendors, and would be geographically contiguous. Global companies weren't out looking for Badger Electric at that time. And so I went because I met some industry contacts, I went and met with both people that would be logical acquirers and people that would not be logical acquirers. And the people that I had formed some friendships with because of industry networks, I'd ask them, well, if I was geographically contiguous to you, how would you value my business? And what I found out, one of them was a publicly traded company that was in 13 related kind of industries. They were they were headquartered in Orlando, Florida, and they had plumbing distributors and electrical distributors and pool supply distributors. And so they were in 13 states with 13 different product lines. And they shared with me the formulas that they used. And they used 13 different formulas.
One for
They
each
kind
industry.
no, not no, actually and their whole thing was they'd pay whatever it took as long as it didn't dilute earnings per share. And other people had formulas based on EBIT. And everybody had a slightly, whether they were a strategic buyer or whatever they were. And so I didn't come up with any one formula, but the one thing that I figured out real quickly is the common denominator to all of this thing was no one wants to dilute their earnings per share, and they don't want to pay for what they're going to create, the cost that they're going to take out. So, but what you got to do is you got to clean up your business and such. You got to drive the largest EBIT that you can get to. I had a couple of people that offered me a value for my business because I was starting up in dumb thinking, well, it's only worth book value. Well, it
Mm-hmm.
turns out it was worth a lot more than book value. But there are formulas that affect every industry, from 1 times gross profit to 4 to 8 times EBIT.
So how did you determine that it was not, or that it was worth more than book value?
Well, because I had people, I went out and kind of shop things. I had people, I'm playing young and dumb. They're, you got to figure out they're trying to steal it. And I kind of did this thing on my own, and I was also not necessarily looking to maximize the price as get something that was fair and maybe continue on.
It's interesting because that's some of the biggest concerns that a lot of the people we know or the listeners have, where what is it that, what are like kind of the pillars that you determine are the values that you want to continue, right? Whether it's keeping your employees, or if it's a certain dollar amount, or if it's certain keeping the culture, or even self-preservation at that point. Is there some stuff that you put together that you wanted to make sure you accomplished?
Oddly, I had a company called Cameron and Barkley, and that wanted to buy my business because they had a related business that had a location in my town. Graybar was the world's largest ESOP that had electrical supply places. And, I just ended up talking to a number of different people over time. And I was talked to them not necessarily at the point that I was ready to sell the business, but when I started thinking about selling the business.
What's the time frame there between when you started thinking and when you actually sold?
Probably about 3 years.
Wow, that's very unique. There's not a lot of people that have got that kind of foresight.
Well, I was under no pressure to sell the business, but I started because I'd had a second open heart surgery. I started thinking my biggest compelling motivator was what if something happens to me? Because by that time I couldn't get enough life insurance to protect my family, and I didn't have a exit strategy because I didn't have I could not have done an ESOP. I didn't have the right employees to do that. And I was fortunate in that a buddy of mine actually was uh, um, in the ESOP business. And so he helped people value their businesses and find ways of doing it. And so I had kind of some free consulting along the way, but it was just kind of yeah. And the best way to find out the value is tell them, no, it's not enough, but don't tell them what formula they ought to use.
I could see you doing that a couple times.
I had, and to have other people, be, I had a bunch of different people that just would tell them, I'm beginning to think about this process.
So it's a combination of friends and professionals that are helping you along the process and at least guiding you, and you're bouncing ideas off of people in the industry, so you got enough time to kind of educate yourself.
Yeah. And go talk to people about, I have an accounting background. I had an idea what it might be worth. And, there's formulas that are out there. And
So you're bouncing around ideas off a bunch of people. You got time to educate yourself, and you kind of have an idea what it's worth and some.
and so I had a buddy that also was somewhat geographically contiguous to us, but he ran an Allen Bradley business. And they were an ESOP down in Iowa. and he was interested in doing it, but the lines didn't line up. So he really sat down and helped me figure it out, kind of gave me an idea of what he would offer.
If you could have done the deal.
He couldn't do the deal because we didn't have the alignment with manufacturers. And so
That is an absolute gold nugget there, because not a lot of people go through the process of potentially selling and then have that person that did the test run on them to help them consult. I mean, that's huge.
yeah, I mean, it was just partly because of my financial background. I understood some of this stuff, and partly because I didn't have a sense of urgency. I'm building net worth every day. I'm making money every day. The business is getting healthier every day. That's the time that you want to sell a business, not when all hell is, broken up. I
Mm-hmm.
sold a business back in 99, and things were still rocking and rolling and showing growth. I mean, it's simple. When you want to sell a business is when sales are going up, when profits are going up, when your leverage is going down.
So how did you line up with Viking then?
Well, oddly, they pursued me, and I had about 3 or 4 people that wanted to buy the business, which is a good position to be in.
Yeah.
And literally, the reason that I sold to them is it just felt better than the other deals.
How did it line up with the different price points?
Similar, basically, I'm not sure I maximized the value. I probably, in retrospect, I wasn't, I never did find the right person to represent me. And my goal was not necessarily to maximize down to the last dollar.
What were some of the other important factors that you're looking at?
One of the factors was the people that helped me build this business. I didn't want anybody to lose jobs.
Okay.
And I literally thought that some of them would lose their jobs. I had a HR person, and I thought, well, she'll be gone. I had an IT guy, and I thought, well, he'll be gone. And but the core people, I did not want them to get wiped out and just be. But because we were geographically contiguous, and basically, but not, I sold to a Minneapolis company. I was located 300 miles away. Turns out that my people were so qualified that that HR person from 18 years ago and that IT person still work for Viking to this day.
Oh, how does that make you feel?
Well, uh, good, obviously. And people that began their career with me 25 and 30 years ago are literally, no one lost their job as a result of this thing.
That is awesome.
You know, I kind of joke that I was the only one that lost my job, and that was only because I was bullheaded and didn't want to do what they wanted me to do right away. And ultimately, I rejoined them, and I've been with them for 10 years now. But I had a stint in there when I went out and started, did nothing for a little bit of time, and then decided I needed, after about 3 weeks, I became bored and started another business.
3 weeks? You didn't even last a month.
I did not last a month, and because I was too young. But I'd accomplished my number one objective was take care of my family and not have a debacle if something would have happened to me. So that was the first objective. Second objective was to look out for my employees. And in fact, I took 10% of my purchase price and put it into, got that grossed up and got them to deliver that to my key people over a 3-year period, a stay pay package. 10% of the price that I sold for, we put in stay pay packages for
That's really
keep
awesome.
some key people, and so that instead of getting pissed off that I sold, they had incentive to stay. So it was good for. Uh, so they grossed it up and made it even more than the 10% that we were talking about. So it was, there were a lot of good elements to it, but I ended up selling to someone that where the culture matched up, and we weren't going to be this financial sale. The guy wanted to get into that marketplace, and some of our key vendors didn't match up. Well, what happened is he had some branches. His closest branch to me was in Wausau, which was about 90 miles away, and they were GE. after he bought my business, he ended up dropping GE in that location and taking on Square D. And now they've bought other Square D businesses out of Milwaukee. And so it became a strategic acquisition for him, not just a financial one. It lined up with a vendor that made more sense for him over in Wisconsin and actually allowed him to expand further.
So when after you sell and the deal's done and the migration has sort of happened, that 3 weeks, explain a little bit about the emotions that you went through.
I don't know that the emotions have ever stopped. I was living my dream. And I would sit there and tell you, I think that part of what got to me is most people that had, um, I think I had some depression going on after the surgeries and kind of had I known I was going to live this long, I don't think I'd have sold the business, even though I don't regret it. But all of a sudden I had a couple of $1 million. And hell, I almost never had, and I was almost living paycheck to paycheck when I was the business owner because everything was in my business. And the next thing you got to do is now, what the hell do you do with this money?
Especially when you don't know how long you're going to live.
Right. And so some of it was, well, now I got this money and don't know how long I'm going to go live. I started investing in some good times.
That's a great investment.
Yes.
I think you have quoted it to me. You've lived 2 bucket lists, I think is what you've said, right?
Oh, I completed 10 of them. How many guys that after open heart surgery have skied in the Alps or became pilots and landed at O'Hare or Boston Logan in a single engine plane or, a number of other things. Um, but I also needed something to do especially when you do it young. After a couple of weeks, your buddies are getting pissed off at you. You're calling them up and saying, "Hey, where are we going for lunch?" The 2 most important questions became, "Who am I going to lunch with today?" And then where? Well, they're still working,
And what
and they
time
get,
can you have your first beer, right?
yeah, right. you know, and so all of a sudden, I found out I needed something to do. Having the money without something to do, and that's another realization that I came to is, boy, you better be careful when you go sell your business, because somehow or other I thought because I've been successful running a business, somebody's going to swoop in and they're going to give me something else to go turn around. And when you have a good business, the thought that you're going to sell it and do something different, well, that's not as easy to realize as it's not only there's an intersection if you're successful in business, and it's the intersection of ability and opportunity. And our ability continues to go with us, but finding the right opportunity is sometimes rare. And the other thing that I found out is I tried some kind of single one-man band businesses, consulting uh, primarily. And when I was out consulting, I wasn't generating new sales leads. And when I was generating leads, I wasn't generating revenue. And so it's like you're kind of, and I had no one to delegate to. And I was really good at the big picture, but some of the small details that I used to delegate, I wasn't so hot at. So being the one-man band business was not
Hard to play all instruments at once.
it's really difficult. I was a good band conductor, but not much of a tuba player,
Oh, that's awesome.
And so, fortunately for me, when I kind of got tired of this consulting and screwing around, I called the people that I sold the business to and said I'd like to get back in. And they offered me a job running one of their divisions. And for 10 years, they allowed me to live under the illusion that I owned that piece of the business. And it was the most profitable piece of their business after I got a hold of it. And the business I sold them was the second most profitable piece of the business.
That's something to be proud of. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so it worked out well.
Well, you've learned a lot of good lessons that have really, I mean, there's just so many things in here. I mean, as far as having the ability and the opportunity to go out and continue to challenge yourself and continue to surround yourself with all the good people is it's a pretty cool deal.
I enjoyed what I did. I enjoyed being a business owner. I enjoyed the recognition that you get with success. I enjoyed helping people inside of their business. We always kind of took a consulting approach to solving problems for folks as opposed to trying to sell them something. It's I don't know at 67, I don't know what the next act is going to be. Some of it you got to figure out on your own.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Conrad. I very much appreciate it. You had a lot of good nuggets for our listeners.
Well, good.